Colin's Last Stand needs your help. If you like what CLS does, whether here on SideQuest in the eclectic interview podcast series Fireside Chats or the retro and nostalgia-fueled show Knockback, please consider showing your support at patreon.com/ColinsLastStand. Doing so not only ensures that CLS keeps making content, but it also gets you cool perks, including exclusive podcasts, early access to shows, the ability to vote on show topics, and much more. Thank you for your kindness, generosity, and support. Without you, Colin's Last Stand cannot and will not exist. Now, on to the show.
This is a Pokeball Plus. Sounds like there's already one inside.
E3 2018 is finally behind us, and I've taken a few days to reflect on the festivities. The fact of the matter is, this year's E3 was pretty weak overall, but that's to be expected. E3s typically go in multi-year cycles, and we're in the valley right now. The console industry is occupying the space between spaces, when developers are speccing their games to next-gen hardware, but when that hardware remains unannounced and under serious lock and key. So if things felt safe and a little restrained, well, trust your gut. Things were indeed safe and a little restrained. If anything, E3 2018 points to a far more dynamic and explosive E3 2019, where we might actually see next-gen games and next-gen hardware, or maybe we won't. But either way, there seems to be a tangible disappointment about this E3, and while I understand that, you should always listen to my advice. Keep your expectations low, because at E3, it's expectations that burn you. But when it comes to the hardware manufacturers, I can't help but shake that there's a tangible thread between them. None of them did what was widely expected of them, at least if you keep your finger on the pulse of the hardcore console gamer. Now, I warned you in my E3 preview video that Sony in particular wasn't going to deliver what so many people thought they were going to deliver, and I was right. But when it comes to Microsoft and Nintendo, well, one exceeded my already lofty expectations, and one failed miserably to even meet fairly low expectations. When taken together, when you look at how Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft all walk away from E3, I can't help but see a picture emerge, one colored by an arrogant Sony, a puzzled Nintendo, and a possibly resurgent Microsoft. The gaming industry never ever remains stagnant. Nintendo dominated, then Sega took over, then Sony came in, then Microsoft swooped into the fray, then Sony came back, then Nintendo did too. These things happen in cycles, and if you pay close enough attention and take the time to examine the subtle texture of the industry, well, you'll see it. We're at the beginning of another seismic shift, and where the tectonics will lead us is anyone's guess. Let's start wrapping our heads around E3 2018 with this statement: Xbox One. No, not Xbox One like the console, I mean Xbox One E3. I said this in my conference review that went up in the afterglow of Phil Spencer and Company's performance. In fact, you could and should go check out my 7 conference reviews right here on SideQuest's YouTube channel if you want more in-depth thoughts on the first and third parties. But it's all worth reiterating. I was blown away by how Microsoft did exactly what it needed to do, and likewise, I was kind of blown away by how many people aren't seeing their conference for what it is. The complaints are common. Microsoft showed a bunch of multi-platform games, their immediate first-party showing is non-existent, and the future of their exclusives remains very much in the realm of the IP we already know: Halo, Gears, Forza. I think those are totally valid observations, and certainly in a vacuum they'd be cause for concern, but this isn't a vacuum. There's plenty of context. Microsoft showed that the Xbox brand is alive. They trotted out third-party partners en masse to show support for their console and their ecosystem. They placated and pleased already engaged Xbox One owners with the IP that they've been playing on Xbox for more than a decade, and they padded their first-party family with 5 new studios. I'm not even remotely an Xbox fan or an Xbox gamer, and I'm still seeing this for exactly what it is: a timely victory. I guess I'm kind of flummoxed because I don't see what else Microsoft could have done. Like, what else could Microsoft have said or presented that's even remotely reasonable? I feel like some people expected them to walk out there with 10 new first-party AAA announcements that would be ready in the next 18 months or something. I honestly think that they're an unfortunately sizable group of gamers that don't really understand how games are made, or how the industry works, or how glacially things move behind the scenes. That Microsoft could cobble together 5 major deals to bring 5 studios into their family, including building one from the ground up, which is a gigantic and expensive undertaking, says a lot about their ability to move and shake. That they could attract third parties and indies to their stage in the numbers they did shows that outside forces still see a vibrancy in the Xbox ecosystem. That they announced new exclusives from established IP shows that their all-important tentpole franchises are still alive and well. And that they didn't announce a bunch of new stuff apart from that showed restraint and intelligence. Remember, they announced Scalebound, Phantom Dust, and Fable Legends too early, and look how that panned out. Now they're dealing with the consequences. This was them dealing with the consequences. Nothing Microsoft did guarantees even a modicum of success, whether with the tail end of Xbox One's lifecycle or with whatever's next. But Microsoft certainly set itself up for success, and you couldn't reasonably ask for much more. I'm a big football fan, so allow me this analogy. It's like a veteran QB going into training camp, one that saw limited success in his early years, really came into his own in his prime years, and then had a gruesome injury that imperiled his career. But instead of crying over spilled milk, he laid low and worked out and ate right and consulted with his doctors and did everything he could to get himself back into winning shape. And now he walks into training camp having done literally every single thing he could have to give himself an advantage. He prepared, he put everything in a row just so, and he left no stone unturned. Will he do well? Will he distinguish himself? Will all of that hard work be worth it? It's impossible to know. All we can say is that he put himself in the best imaginable position to succeed. Everything from there will revolve around execution and execution alone. Microsoft and its Xbox brand represent that QB trying to climb the ladder again. And the way some folks hand-wave their conference basically says that Microsoft shouldn't have showed up at all. And that's just bizarre to me. I think they did great, and I can't wait to see how they navigate this new road. They may just ultimately eat shit, it's entirely possible. But at least they didn't surrender, quite the contrary in fact. They blitzed with a surprising counteroffensive instead. Bravo. On the other end of the spectrum, for me anyway, is Nintendo, who I think put up a woefully unimpressive fight at E3. Now, their press conference was an absolute marvel from a production and execution standpoint, and everyone should do it just like them. Nothing live, no theatrics, no gigantic waste of time and moments of pure cringe. Just games. Thing is, Nintendo doesn't really have that many games of major consequence, and it's the exact problem I predicted and hoped they'd avoid when I did my E3 preview. Switch's first year was nothing short of dominant, a hybrid piece of hardware catapulted by two major games from two major franchises. Now that those games have come and gone, Nintendo needed to actively avoid its sophomore slump, and well, it isn't. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate looks awesome, but I feel like the general consensus is that it was also kinda underwhelming. Smash does big numbers with an impressive attach rate, but it's not going to push tons of hardware, just like Smash didn't push tons of N64s or Wii U's. And I'll reiterate that I think that the new Pokemon looks pretty cool, but it's not the mainline Pokemon that hardcore fans really want. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, and the market surely agrees. Nintendo stock is declining rapidly and has been for most of June, even before E3, though, as I said on Twitter, context is important. Nintendo is still doing fine, a company flush with cash, and with its hands helping to mold lots of different projects. But we're talking about Switch itself here, and for Nintendo to hit its lofty fiscal year goals, I'll remind you, it actually increased not too long ago. It needs more big games, not old Bethesda ports, indies we can already play on Xbox One, PS4, and PC, and whatever else. I think Switch is such an impressive and likable piece of hardware, but it'll always be rooted in what Nintendo itself pushes out the door, accompanied by these aforementioned products. Without the next Zelda or Mario, and I'm not literally talking about games from those franchises, but rather big Nintendo exclusive IP, Switch simply isn't going to sustain its momentum. The market knows that, which is why it reacted the way it did, and I think we all know that in our guts too. Without games, Switch isn't interesting. That's true for literally any piece of gaming hardware. And not to prematurely sound the klaxon, but when the new hardware from Sony and Microsoft rolls out in 2019 or 2020, Switch is going to look ancient by comparison, and it's only going to hurt the hardware even more and stymie its ability to get third-party ports, which Switch will not be able to handle. It can barely run Doom at 60 frames. So now is the time to strike, and Nintendo is letting sand go through the hourglass instead. From my perspective, it's not that Nintendo was caught off guard by the post-Zelda and post-Mario reality it finds itself in. It's that Nintendo launched its hardware with two games that, for this generation anyway, it'll probably never replicate in terms of critical or commercial success. It did what it had to do, and I respect it for that. It fired with all cannons, and it worked wonders, because Switch's PS4-like trajectory cemented it in the hearts and minds of gamers around the world, including in my own. But that kind of move comes with its own deficits, and if you're not prepared for your sophomore and junior years before your freshman year even occurs, then you're not going to be able to do much about that, at least in the realm of video games. Nintendo finds itself there right now. So it wasn't that I was surprised that their Nintendo Direct was soft. I was more surprised that they didn't surprise me again, if that makes any sense. Because they've been full of surprises for the last 2 years or so, and it's been awesome to watch. This felt like old Nintendo from a product standpoint, and well, old Nintendo simply isn't going to fly. I'm rooting for them to turn it around, and frankly, I think they will. But if you're feeling a little bearish about Switch right now, I can't say I blame you. As far as PlayStation is concerned, I think we're starting to see shades of old, arrogant Sony, and that really concerns me. Then again, let's remember what I said at the top. We're in the space between spaces, and Sony, as the frontrunner, happens to be there more than anyone else. I insisted they wouldn't make first-party announcements, and they didn't. And that was super smart because, let's be honest, any of their studios not working on the 3 first-party developed games shown, The Last of Us Part 2, Ghost of Tsushima, and Dreams, in addition to Days Gone, are on to PlayStation 5. And if you're confused, Spider-Man and Death Stranding are exclusives made outside of the PlayStation Studio ecosystem. So it makes a lot of sense to clear your plate before you dump more food on it, especially if you literally can't talk about what's next. The hardware announcements must come first. And while I'm totally convinced you saw games at E3 that are actually next-gen, like Cyberpunk, we have to get through what we're already dealing with before we deal with what's next. From that perspective, Sony's approach makes sense. But if Nintendo nailed its production and presentation while forgetting about the games, well, Sony did the exact opposite. While few people will contend that there's a stronger catalog of upcoming games anywhere than what Sony has coming to PS4, it's also true that they could have shoved that entire showing into 30 or 45 minutes, instead of wantonly wasting viewers' time with set changes and droll live interviews. Does the substance matter more than the style? Absolutely, categorically it does. But I'll also remind you that if Sony wasn't dominating its competition, you wouldn't have gotten such a silly tone-deaf presentation. And so perhaps I'm being a bit too meta, but it's that I'm focused on. Reading between the lines as opposed to just examining the games, which look uniformly awesome. Because the style is going to dictate the substance in the years to come, not vice versa. And honestly, I'd rather the substance inform the style instead. In reality, Sony's performance was more middling than an actual loss, but still, if you were around for the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3 days, your spider sense was probably tingling. It's almost as if you've seen this nonsense somewhere before, and you have every right to ask tough questions as to how we found ourselves back in such a strange place. This is very much Sony's game to lose. I wonder if they'll ever realize that. So that's E3 2018 in a nutshell. A resurgent Microsoft, an inadequate Nintendo, and an arrogant Sony, all mixing it up in a rather quiet year as we wait for what should be a nuclear blast in 2019. But now, the festivities are in our rearview mirror, so let's focus on what's ahead. And boy oh boy do we have a lot to get through before the next gen arrives. It's exciting, to say the very least.
Where's their head at?